I usually enjoy starting by diving into the guests' experience and like their journey, but I like to do that through stories. And in your case, I mean, there are many stories that we could dive into. I read many in the book, and that was like really, really interesting. But I guess that a better way to dive into your journey for people listening to have more of an idea of who you are is for you to share like what role has nature had over your years, like transitioning throughout different places. So I think that you have lived in Germany, Kenya, Denmark. Those are the ones that I could find out, but I'm not sure if you have lived in other places. But I know that you have traveled a lot. So I would like to know like the personal side of like your work. Like, yeah, what role has nature had over your life, like since you were much younger to like your current work right now at Salesforce and the UN. So yeah, if you could dive into that, it'll be great.
I think nature has been always the main element of my life, but it started actually earlier than that. I knew when I was very young that I wanted to work with forests, partly because it runs in the family. My grandfather was a forest engineer, and so I spent a lot of time with him in the forest. But also because I grew up in a rural village. There was really not much else to do but to spend a lot of time in nature and hiking and camping and fishing. So I think that love for nature has been with me since my childhood. And then I had this image of becoming a forester, studying forestry and working with forests. And I knew since I was about 12, I think, that was my career path. I studied forestry, but then instead of working in the forest, I ended up working in an international career and protecting forests mostly from behind a desk, like, many of us do. But now I try to compensate for that by living on a farm, and we have several small patches of forest, and we planted a new forest 2.5 years ago. So it's still
Hmm.
with me, but that's nature has always been the guiding path of my career.
Okay, so you mentioned that it was your grandfather, right? Who you were like going with on walks and like exploring a forest with. That's very interesting because like I usually like to ask my guests like that background because it also provides more context for people listening to understand like the personal side of things because it's not always just like the work that you have been doing or focusing on talking about ecology just for the sake of it. Many times comes from like some personal experience or set of experiences, right? So it's interesting that it was your case with that. So with this, I want to start like diving into your book, which is like a great breakdown of the problems that we have been facing as humanity throughout like many years. I mean, since I was like I'm 20, so like since I was very young, people were already talking about like recycling, reducing, reusing, and like these principles to try to live more aligned with the environment and with nature. But like that was just those were some ideas. But as time has gone by, you see people more and more being worried about the actual effects of things, right? So, for example, in your book, I read that in Zambia, I'm not sure what year this was, but that you were there like traveling, I think, and that you experienced a time in which they had like no energy, which was unusual for that country, not specific, like yeah, for that region in which you were at. And then I have also heard like in some interviews that you talked about what happened in Sao Paulo, like the water supply problems. So I would like you to get into those two quickly so that we can like also dive into what problems are happening right now, like in the environment and for us as humanity.
Yeah, so the book is called Generation Restoration, and it has a number of stories from around the world of our relationship with nature and what happens when that relationship goes pear shaped. What happens when we we're in a suicidal war with nature. This is the UN Secretary General's word. Not mine, but I think it's a really fitting description of a relationship crisis that we have to fix. So I was in Zambia in March 2024, and Zambia has an ample supply of hydropower. There's a dam they share with Zimbabwe, and that provides about 70% of the country's electricity, and it's been very stable. But in that year, there was a record drought, and that meant the water levels in the Kariba Dam had fallen to record lows. There was also almost no rainfall. The harvest was an almost complete failure. What you find then when suddenly there's an energy crisis, there's a food crisis, there's a water crisis, this becomes the defining element of politics. Nothing else matters. You have to provide food, water, and energy to your people. And the answer to that crisis on all three aspects was ecology, because the only water that was still flowing came from forested watersheds in Zambia that had relatively intact forests. The only food that was being still harvested came from agroforestry, not from monoculture maize plantations and fields, but from agroforestry, which is a more ecologically balanced way of producing food with crops under trees. And so the shade and the water that was still there allowed the farmers to harvest. And this prompted the government then to look at a border-to-border ecosystem restoration plan for the country. Not as something that's nice to have, because it's nice to have nature, but as something that without an ecological transformation, the country would face collapse. And I think it's indicative of what many other countries could be facing in the next decades. So I thought that was a good case study to learn from, even though Zambia, it sounds like it's far away, it's in Southern Africa, but we can learn from that also for many other countries. The other example where a recent shift in or an understanding of basic ecological literacy helped a large population to turn things around is in Sao Paulo. So the greater Sao Paulo area is about 20 million people. And it was sort of around 2010, the country started to experience severe water problems. And they were at the end of where they could fix this with technology, digging deeper wells and making more aqueducts. So the city government and with some help from the private sector, implemented a very large forest restoration program along all the rivers and watersheds in the greater Sao Paulo area. So they allowed forests to capture, filter, and channel back into the water reservoirs, into the water basins, sufficient rainwater to replenish water levels. So this is what you call a nature-based solution to a problem that we face. And I think we'll see more and more of those in the future because we've taken nature for granted, while in fact, nature is critical infrastructure for all human societies. It's critical infrastructure for everything we eat, everything we drink, everything that we build our homes with, even how we construct our cities. But we're not used to thinking about nature in that way. Nature is just sort of there, and we mostly take from nature without ever thinking about that we have to have a reciprocal relationship with nature. We have to build a new relationship with nature. So that's what my book is about.
Sure. I think that there are many things to unpack from there, and I have like different points that I actually wanted to go through. And I guess that the first one that makes sense to actually start diving into is ecology, which I liked how you talked about that in the book, because you were like going back many centuries to like the Greeks and talking about like different books that were written back then, or Aristotle's philosophy and the actual meaning of the word ecology. So I have like 3 points regarding this that I would like you like to just dive into. So the first one is ecology being defined as like a common home, right? That's very easy to grasp definition for it, and it actually also is very impactful, because like if you think about that as like your common home, that includes you as well, and you want to be comfortable in your home, so it's like, I mean, it's got to be relevant for individuals. Then the second thing is eudaimonia, which I have heard many times in like personal development podcasts, or I have read about it in like personal development books, but it's the first time that I like read about it in like an ecology or an environment focused book, which is really interesting, because I think that it's good to be able like to combine those two, like your personal progress being also the progress of like the alignment to the natural world, right? And then the third part, which is like the combination of these ideas that you talked about in that part of the book, is a wise management of nature, which is, I think, something that many companies and governments are trying to work towards, but not necessarily at a pace at which we would be able to sustain our own like development and way of living. So I would like you to dive into this and into like the context of what these ancient learnings and things that happened, what those teach us about the situation in which we are right now.
Yeah, I think history is fascinating to study when it comes to our relationship with the natural world. And if we look at the root of the word ecology, you mentioned it, it's our common home. So the first part of ecology comes from ancient Greek oikos. That is our common household, our common home. And ecology is the knowledge of our common home. Economy, we're all very used to talking about the economy.
Mhm.
Everybody is an expert on the economy, right? It has the same root. It's the management of our common home. What we're doing right now on planet Earth, we're managing it with our economy without the knowledge of how it works, which is ecology. So we have to reconcile economy and ecology, because if we don't know what the basis of our common home is, what are the resources that we can actually use without imbalance in the system, we have to learn basic ecological literacy, which is one of the key aspects of the book. And then I spoke with a fellow author called John Perlin, who wrote one of my favorite nonfiction books called A Forest Journey. So he's chronicled over the last 5,000 years humanity's relationship with forests from ancient texts that he studied, and he traced that all the rise and fall of civilizations was always linked to the rise and fall of forest ecosystems where they lived. And
Okay.
the ancient Greek is no exception. They were in a war with Sparta. This was the arch rival of Athens. And in about 400 years before the Common Era, they ran out of wood for everything. There was a quote in John's book saying there was nothing but food for bees in the hills around Athens in Greece, because they built ships with every single available tree. And all the ships had sunk to the bottom of the Mediterranean. So the Greeks then, and this was the era when also Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, I mean, they overlapped for a little bit of time, and they didn't agree on a lot of things, but they agreed on one thing, which is that we depend on nature and we have to have a wiser management and stewardship of nature. So from about 400 to 300 before the Common Era, in Greece, there was a very strong legal framework for the protection and restoration of nature. In the beginning, it was even forbidden to collect fallen branches for firewood, because wood was the main energy source at the time, was used to heat food and even homes. But there was such a restriction on the use of wood in the beginning, because there was just none available, that it was under severe penalty to collect firewood. But then over the years, as they replanted forests at a national scale, forests started to reappear, the water table and water level stabilized. The ancient Greece returned to its predominant position as a Mediterranean power, and you could call that a century of ecology. I don't think it's actually called that anymore
Mhm.
other than in my book. But if you think about that, we're in a similar situation now, that we have depleted our natural resources. We've cut down about 50% of all the trees in the world that were there before the agricultural revolution. We've almost wiped out 73% of all wildlife populations since the 1970s. So this is within my lifetime. We've lost over 70% of wildlife populations. If you would weigh all the mammals on planet Earth today, 4% of mammals are wildlife. The rest are humans and livestock. So we are living in a sort of 10% world. We really have depleted our natural world to such a degree that we have to restore it. Because if we don't, we won't have enough food, energy, water for soon 10 billion people. So ecosystem restoration and this kind of a century of ecology that teaches us basic ecological literacy, but also rebuilds that infrastructure that we need for civilization to thrive, is essential. Yet we are still seen as the people talk about nature as the fairy dust tree huggers who want to do things because they They love nature. And yeah, that's true. I love nature. I love trees, and I even love hugging trees. But it's not the main reason why we should invest as a civilization and as an economy. The main reason for that is we have taken and taken and taken from nature, and now our natural capital bank account, if you will, is overdrawn. It's in the red. There's no more money coming out if we want to extract more from nature. So we have to reinvest. That's the core theme of the book.
Yeah, I mean, highlighting again something you said in the beginning, which just struck me, is that like I hadn't thought that, for example, with the adoption of AI, many countries and many school systems started like to quickly try to adopt the learning and teaching of how to use AI and these new technologies, right? But and that's like after some, it's not necessarily a crisis at all, but it's like after some events that have like impacted the world, and so people are like, oh, okay, we need to do something about AI. But then when it comes to ecology, it's like many things have been happening, and that has been like for a much longer time, but still that's not like you don't see the same as you see for AI. Like many school systems are not yet like implementing new subjects like to teach ecology, for example, as like having economy or well economics. But I mean that's really something that just struck me. Have you seen like any example around the world that is like of any country or a school system or organization that is doing something right in that direction?
Well, there's two examples maybe, and since you mentioned AI, I think AI can of course be a catalyst for spreading that knowledge in a much more rapid and also deeper way. And I'll come back to that in a second. But I think I just returned from Brazil at the UN Climate Conference, which was for the first time held in the Amazon. So this was in a city called Belém, which is the northeast of Brazil. And it lies close to the ocean. It's surrounded by rivers and is right next to the Amazon rainforest. And what I saw there was really fascinating because a lot of people in the city were focused on what the government calls the bioeconomy. So, how to live with nature, how to get value from nature, but at the same time not deplete nature, especially with agroforestry. And there's a lot of people harvesting and marketing things like acai berries, and there's a lot of fisheries. I think the ecological literacy that we need is still there in many places. Many places are aware, and many people are aware that we fully depend on nature. It's not something that we have to start from scratch. And I was really struck in Brazil how many people, especially young people, are aware of the importance of the Amazon for the entire rest of the country's rainfall. If we lose the Amazon and it tips into a degraded ecological state, which in the case of the Amazon would be from a moist tropical forest to a savanna woodland that has more frequent fires, and most of Latin America would lose a considerable part of their rainfall that feeds all of the agriculture in South America. So it's basically something we can't afford to lose, and a surprising number of people are aware of that. We're only now beginning to study how this actually works with something called the flying rivers, because there are estimated 300 billion trees in the Amazon, and they evaporate so much moisture every day that forms sort of flying rivers that carry clouds and water to most of the rest of South America. But I think we are aware of the role of nature. Most people are aware. We maybe lack the specific scientific knowledge, and that is something that AI can help us to regain. And in the book, I talk about three basic things for ecological literacy. Know where your food comes from. So basically, who's your farmer? Where are the fields where your food comes from? How does it get to you? Where does your water come from? When you turn on the tap, where is it actually pumped out of the ground? How is it filtered? How is it cleaned? Where does it enter the ground again from rainfall? And then what species do you share your home, your community, your city, your country with? And all of those things AI can really help to trace and teach you very quickly. I mean, they're great AI assisted apps now, like bird identification apps and leaf snap and things that can tell you which plants are
Mhm.
in your garden or on your forest path. So I think AI can really help us, but that basic ecological understanding that we are part of nature, but have just forgotten that, or we've been taught otherwise for a couple of centuries now. I think that basic knowledge is still there in most people.
I know that you have like a lot of projects and things going on and like many things that you are putting your focus and time into, but have you, well, first of all, do you have any current like platform or anything like that where maybe like an AI agent where people just can just go and like answer some survey questions and like figure out where their water comes from and like those things? Sorry. Like, yeah, do you currently personally or as part of some organization have something like that? And if not, have you thought about doing something like that?
That's really an interesting idea. I haven't thought about that because nothing like that at the moment exists. But what does exist are more and more platforms where people can share with others what they're doing. One of my favorites is Restore. It's restore without an e at the end .eco, eco, and Restore is like the sort of like the LinkedIn of global restoration projects. There's now almost 300,000 projects around the world that have uploaded their profiles on Restore, where you can see who in your surrounding community, who in your city is restoring nature, has a restoration project. These range from very small backyard projects to almost entire coastlines, and in some cases entire countries. So they vary in size, but you can see basically who's already working on this. You can connect with them. You can learn from the restoration work that is happening, and in many cases also volunteer. And there are many other networks where you can actually get engaged in restoration work. But I'm not aware of a sort of the AI PhD, ecology PhD in your pocket that you can carry around with you that can answer
Hmm.
all questions. But I'm sure that's just a question of time
Yeah,
until that is
and
out
and,
there.
uh, and I mean, even if it doesn't exist yet, like people can just go like to ChatGPT, maybe create a chat to have the AI figure out like where the food, the water most likely come from, and what species they share their environment with. But yeah, that's just like an idea that came to my mind that I wanted to ask. Then going back to the economy and ecology, I liked that you mentioned in the book as well that we are used to thinking about progress as individuals and as a society or as countries, for example, in terms of like the yeah, mostly money, right? And that's like in terms of like countries, the GDP. But then you mentioned that we need to start to shift how we think about these things. So for example, as individuals or as businesses, changing the way business is done, right? And maybe focusing on partnering with suppliers who are more environmentally aligned or doing things like that. And then as countries focusing on on determining the progress of the country, not just in terms of GDP, but as well as like the value of nature, for example, as part of the whole ecosystem. I would like you to dive into that and into, for example, what are some indicators that already exist? So, I mean, I know that GDP is one, but then that's just like money focused, right? What are other types of indicators that focus more like on the nature aspect as well, or they integrate it?
Yeah, so there's a lot happening in that space, which is promising. But in the world of finance, things tend to happen fairly slowly. But when there is a shift, the entire system shifts. And I think we're seeing that at the moment. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So insurance is really critical for everything in the economy. If you can't insure a home, no bank will lend you money to buy your home, right? So insurance is really, really important for all kinds of aspects of the economy. Recently, there's been a shift in the knowledge of actuaries. So actuaries are the people who price how much insurance costs. Based on statistics, they can tell you how likely it is that how long you're likely to live, and then they price the life insurance based on that. So that statistical knowledge of how expensive it is to insure a home or a boat or your personal health, and they have recently priced in climate and ecological risk into that equation. So that means now the decisions of where to build a house, for example. Should you build it in a floodplain
Hmm.
area, which is likely to be flooded? Should you build it in a way that is likely to make climate change worse or make it better? Should you build it very close to the coastline? All these things are starting to be priced into the real economy because of insurance. The other example is something called the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which is a framework for companies to price nature-related risks and opportunities into their balance sheet. That is also fairly new. It's only started in the last 2 years, and now it's gotten a lot of traction. And at a government level, also fairly recently, governments have started to account for natural capital, which is basically
Mm-hmm.
if you only look at GDP, gross domestic product, it doesn't really tell you very much about how your country is doing, because you can burn and sell and liquefy all your natural capital, like all your forests, all your clean water, all your rivers, all your wildlife. If you sell all of that off, you might make some money in the short term and that boosts your GDP, but you've actually just spent all your natural capital. So in the
Mm-hmm.
long term, you'll be much worse off. And governments are starting to now measure both so that you have a more holistic view of how your country is doing, how healthy your population is, which in turn is, of course, also a function of how healthy nature is and how healthy the environment is. So all of these things are starting to happen in the background. People are not really paying a lot of attention to it because it's often very technical work. There's a very voluminous manual by the United Nations called the Statistics Handbook, and that has something in it called the System of Environmental Economic Accounting. I doubt many people have ever heard of that, but it's actually a very important handbook because it guides how governments measure a nation's wealth. And that is really important because the finance minister sets taxes according to that. They set political and monetary incentives according to that to guide how the country is doing. So that handbook is really, really important, and it now has natural capital in it. That's very promising.
I mean, like that you mentioned, like natural capital, because it's very easy to think about that in terms of, for example, the opportunity cost that a country takes when, yeah, as you mentioned, like selling not everything, but like many of its natural resources, and how that has a huge impact in the long term, especially if they don't focus as well on like restoring those resources. Because I mean, if they have like I don't know, but maybe share your thoughts on this as well. But like, if they sell some part of their natural resources, but they also have activities that focus on replenishing those, then maybe it's something that on the long term is more sustainable, both in ecology and in the economy, right? But if they don't have those activities and they are just like selling that, and that will not be restored, do you think about it that way?
Yeah, it's a bit linked to how you would build personal wealth. You wouldn't basically, if you say, I'll sell both my kidneys because, I'll make a lot of money and then I'll be rich, but you'll be,
Yeah,
you'll run into longer term problems
sure.
that will not really, a little bit of money in the short term will not help you.
Mm,
So that's similar to how some countries have managed their natural capital. If you just sell it off in the short term to make some
mhm,
short term cash, it doesn't help you in the long term. So I think a lot of countries are starting to learn from that and are shifting to a different way of managing national wealth and measuring
mm,
national wealth,
mhm,
including the health of the environment, health of the people, social capital, levels of education. So we're moving beyond GDP as our main indicator for national wealth. This is a shift that is starting to happen and that will accelerate because once that new way of measuring the economy is in place, it will also influence a lot of decisions and market signals for the private sector. And again, it's something really encouraging I came back with from Brazil, that this shift to clean energy, the shift to the bioeconomy, the shift to nature restoration at industrial scale is really starting to happen.
mm,
I visited a project in the Amazon last week, which is now the largest forest restoration project in the Amazon, restoring native forests on 20,000 hectares. Visited one of their the farms where they do this of 3,000 hectares, which I think is like more than 100 times the size of Manhattan, for example. And they're planting forests really at industrial scale, a lot of different native species, but at a very, very large scale. And that's really new. That didn't exist just a couple of years ago. That sort of response to the Amazon deforestation crisis. Of course, we also have to still stop deforestation in the first place.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
once we have slowed that down, restoring millions of hectares of degraded land worldwide is an urgent task, but also a massive opportunity.
Yeah. No, and that's a good point as well. That it's not only about like the actions and the initiatives that are like pro environmental alignment, but it's also about like not continuing the other activities that are damaging the environment. There is one last like aspect of the book that I would like to dive into before like just some other questions about your work and about technology, because that's something that I am interested in. Well, in hearing your thoughts about. But yeah, like first the part of the book about like the shifting baseline syndrome. So that I guess that's like a very good way to explain how we are how we have become unaware of the changes in the environment, right? So you talk about like this analogy of if a frog jumps into hot water, it will just like jump out of it quickly. But if you put a frog in water and then start to quickly, well, not quickly, to slowly bring the temperature of the water up, then it'll just stay there because it will not like necessarily notice it immediately. So, and that's something that has been happening to us. And the example of the book that was like most shocking to me was oysters in New York. Because like, for instance, I had no idea that New York had oysters like 100 years ago, and that like before that it was like full of oysters, and then it was like very abundant environment, right? So that was really striking, because I mean, if I think of New York right now, I just think of like the skyscrapers and the big city and these things, not at all about New York as a place where the environment thrives. Yeah, I would like you to dive into that so that people listening can get a sense of what that idea is about, and then after that, I want to get like in the technology side of things. But yeah, we will first dive in.
That's why I use this the metaphor of the 10% world, because I think we have to realize that we were once so much richer in terms of our natural heritage. And if we could find a way to show that to people, I think getting back to that level of natural wealth would be much easier, because we have the science, the technology, even the money to do that. But people need to know what it is that we have lost and what we could get back. So that imagination and that inspiration is important. Yeah, there were once an estimated 3 billion oysters around New York City on almost 200,000 acres. And they covered everything of what is today New York Harbor. Until the early 20th century, New York actually was well known globally for its oysters. They exported oysters to Germany, England, to France. New Yorkers ate oysters constantly. But what happened then was that there's a lot of untreated sewage that was led into the New York Harbor area. So the water became too polluted for the oysters to thrive. And they also over-harvested oysters at the same time. The last commercial oyster bed in New York closed in 1927. But there's a project underway now called the Billion Oysters Project to reseed the entire harbor area with oysters again, because the water has been getting a bit cleaner. It's not quite clean enough yet. But if you had these oyster beds, these oyster reefs, because they sort of cling together, they stick together and they form these massive reefs out in the water. If you had oyster reefs back at significant scale, it would protect the city from major storm surges. You remember the superstorm Sandy that flooded New York a couple of years ago? And the that sort of basic critical infrastructure is so important for the city. But New Yorkers need to know that New York should be called the Big Oyster. It shouldn't be called the Big Apple. That's actually a much more accurate name. But people don't know. If you would speak to an average New Yorker, they wouldn't necessarily know. So spreading that awareness And I'm also dreaming of a Netflix series of large scale landscape restoration where you could use AI to generate actually the images of what that would look like, what the
Mm-hmm.
clear water in New York Harbor would look like, what having dolphins and other marine mammals back in the harbor would look like with these massive oyster reefs, so that people would know, well, this is what we could have again, and why don't we? Why are we not demanding that level of natural wealth back? Because we could have it back.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, what is also part of what creates friction to go towards this vision, I think, is that this city specifically has changed a lot in the way it is defined. So you mentioned that like many years ago, it was considered like it was known for its oysters, but right now it's like maybe like the finance center that it is like in the US and like in the world, because it's like one of the biggest cities in that aspect. And then also like how international it is. So you think of New York with these labels first, then with oysters. So it's like you have not necessarily to remove this, but like to add this on top of that. And that's also like, for example, for tourists, I guess that like no one will immediately just catch like, oh yeah, oysters in New York. They need like to go through this process, but it's good that like these projects are happening so that people also become more aware of these things. And then I wanted to talk about, as I mentioned, like technology. And you mentioned before that there are times where we only have like, I'm not sure what the term is, but like natural solutions or nature solutions. What was the term that you
Nature-based
use?
solutions, yeah, that's the
Nature-based
most common
solutions.
term.
Yeah, nature-based solutions. But then what about like these other more technology-based solutions, which is what many people like first think about when thinking about like solutions for environmental problems. And this can be like things as obvious as like renewable energy, but then less obvious things as, for example, talking about data centers, these startups that are seeking to send databases to space so that the pollution related to like those databases here on Earth is like not here, but that it's like outside of the Earth. So like initiatives like that, or also there is this company in Switzerland and Iceland, I think it's called Climeworks. So they they take CO2 from the air and then they put that like into these places where they cultivate food, and then also like into the ground, like, and that's all technology based, right? I know that like the scale of that might not be very, yeah, like the pace at which that technology is developed might not be at the same pace at which all of these problems are developing. So that's like another thing to consider. But yeah, what do you think about this more alternative or less intuitive technological solutions?
I think they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. They can actually be combined. The
Hmm.
important philosophical shift we have to understand is that we are part of nature. Humans are part of nature. With all our cities, all our technology, everything that we've ever invented is also nature. That's a very, very different way of looking at nature than we're used to. For many of us, and I sort of sometimes catch myself even in that, thinking that nature is somewhere out there.
Hmm.
But we are nature, which means we are ecosystem engineers, just like other species that shape entire landscapes. We're just more powerful than most other species. So when we think of it that way, of course, technology is a tool that we can use and deploy, and we can work often also to enhance nature and enhance ecosystem functions. I think what is important, though, is to work with nature as an ally and not try to replace nature, or in some cases, replicating nature is also not is also a bit limiting. If you take direct air capture, which you mentioned, companies
Hmm.
like Climeworks, this is exactly what trees do for free, right? And they've done that
Yeah.
for a little over 3 billion years. Plants to photosynthesize and basically take CO2 out of the air and turn it into oxygen and useful byproducts like wood and clean water. So sometimes I think we also overestimate our abilities, and we're a bit hubristic as humans. We think we know it all, and that human technology is superior to nature. That is absolutely not the case.
Hmm.
We we still have a lot to learn from nature. There, for example, these tiny organisms called tardigrades that you can actually move them into space for an extended period of time and they will fall into such a strong state of hibernation that they survive being out in space. And then when they come back to Earth, they sort of spring back to life. There's no amount of human technology that can do something like that, and won't probably be able for hundreds of years. So we overestimate how clever we are by far. But that is not to say that technology doesn't play a role. Of course, technology has an important role to play. And often when we use what is called biomimicry, for example, learning from nature, how to construct data centers in a way that has the natural cooling ability of a termite mound, for example, that brings down the cooling costs of data centers significantly. We can use biomimicry for the design of planes, cars, buildings. We can construct our cities in a way that builds on the natural cooling capacity of urban forests and trees. So we can learn a lot from nature for technology and with technology. We often see these as two opposing worlds, but they're not. We just have to make sure we understand that we are part of nature and learn from nature in much of what we design with our technology.
Sure. Even if you think about like people in STEM in general, like they are always like into like these hard skill subjects like physics, maths, things that people don't necessarily link to like the other side of the spectrum. But then again, this is all just like a conceptual framework, which is like biology and ecology and these things. But it's totally true that like combining these two, maybe not necessarily for direct applications, but for like translating the functioning of something in one field to another is something that is totally a way to bring new solutions, right? So that's
Well,
very
at least
interesting.
they're all called natural sciences. I think that's
Yeah,
still, at least
that's a good thing.
they are connected, and it's not so difficult to see the connections. But what is difficult is that there's very little interdisciplinary research, because often when we go through formal education and then we do a PhD in physics, and we're very deep into our sector and our field.
Mhm.
And we don't have the time or the capacity or the ability to read the scientific literature also in ecology or medicine or other fields, but AI has the ability to do that. So if we work with AI, I think that one of the biggest opportunities in the coming years will be that making those connections in interdisciplinary research. What is the relation, for example, between medicine and the health of the environment? What is the relation between healthy ecosystems, healthy water, healthy forests, and the health of an urban population? We don't measure these things because there's nobody who is both an ecologist and a medical researcher and somebody who works in civil engineering. There's no person in the world who has that knowledge. But AI can look at all those disciplines and then make those connections and tell you, well, if you have more green space in your city and you have cleaner water because your city is surrounded by forest, your health costs drop by 30%. And, that shouldn't be surprising, but we don't study these connections enough.
Yeah, it's totally true. One last question before like three questions I always ask all of my guests. And the question before that is related to this. Do you think that moving on, and especially for younger generations, there is value in focusing on interdisciplinary skills and beyond skills like knowledge? So like, of course, like still diving deep into one area, for example, but maybe not just becoming one specialist isolated in that area, but like rather having these this ability to translate things between different areas of knowledge, or also like studying things with well, interdisciplinarily. I'm not sure if that's a word, but yeah, like interdisciplinarily, because you have some knowledge in other areas too. Do you think there's value in that?
Well, it's a hard question what to advise somebody who studies right now, because the world is really so different from when I studied 25 years ago. What I would say is focus on the human connections and the relationships of what it is that we collectively want to become on Earth. Why are we here? And one of the reasons why we're on the planet is to become better persons, but it's also to make the connections with other humans for a collective good. I think we have to move beyond this individual maximization of utility and hoarding wealth and becoming wealthy. And it's there's more to life than that, and that more is lies in relationships and the understanding of what makes a good civilization and a good thriving environment for humanity. So understanding that and then being able to move towards that with tools like science, interdisciplinary research, AI, that is what we really need from the next generation. How to do that, I'm not sure, but if you have that as your guiding principle, you'll find a good way.
Great. Well, thanks for that advice for people listening, since many of them are just like people like me, people my age. So that's really valuable. Then the last three questions is just rapid fire questions to finish off the podcast. First of all, what is a book, a movie, a music album, something that you have watched or consumed recently that you enjoyed? It can be related to this or just to anything else.
Yeah, I recommend a Japanese Studio Ghibli movie called Princess Mononoke, which,
Mm.
if you haven't seen it yet, you should definitely watch that. It's a parable of life on Earth and how we relate to it, and it has a lot to do with restoring nature at planetary scale.
Great. Then the second thing is, what is something that you have learned or discovered recently that you found valuable or interesting? It can be, again, related to any of the topics we discussed or to anything new, maybe a platform, a tool, an app, anything.
It's about food. So when you
Okay.
look at Western diets, you live in Spain, I live in Denmark, the Western world, we basically rely on 12 plant species: wheat, maize, corn, rice, a couple of others, for three-quarters of our calories. When I was in the Amazon, there are 4,000 edible species, and indigenous communities there use about 1,500 different species for their food. That is a mind-blowing difference of
Hmm.
diversity and interesting nutrition and food chains, supply chains that we could build in the future that are so much richer and so much more diverse than what we're used to. I think there's a huge potential there in what is called the bioeconomy.
Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting because I mean, it's intuitive for people from the West like to just look at the food they eat and then see like many things that they usually consume on a day-to-day basis. But then like to compare that to other parts of the world where it's like much more diverse is really striking. And then the last thing is my podcast is called Coffee Lounge, and so I like to ask just for fun, what is your favorite kind of coffee? And yeah, what's like your favorite situation for drinking coffee? And for the first part, like it can be a specific drink, a specific bean, anything.
Well, I just finished my cup of coffee here while we were talking, so I certainly I love coffee. My favorite coffee is I've tried several different coffees. I just brought back some from Brazil, and I like to buy whole beans with a medium roast and then have a coffee grinder. So I make my
Mm.
own coffee grinds here at home. I think that's really important that you don't buy pre-ground coffee, but that you grind it yourself because it preserves a lot of the flavor.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Great. And the situation in which you enjoy drinking coffee, like maybe a conversation with a friend or like a specific place, specific coffee shop, something like that.
I love I definitely loved this idea of taking a cup of coffee and going on my morning walks across the
Mm.
farm and being sort of out there, especially when the air is a bit crisp and cold here in Northern Europe, and you have a hot cup of coffee and I'll take a walk out into the fields or to the forest. I love that enjoyment of coffee together with nature.
Yeah, that's great and sounds really really good. Well, is there anything else you want to add? Anything else you want to mention?
Well, I really hope that many of your listeners resonate with this idea of generation restoration, which is the title of the book, and love to hear from them on LinkedIn, Instagram, whatever social media you use, what you think. And if you want to become part of Generation Restoration, which is also the hashtag of the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, which we're in, and we're halfway now. So the next 5 years will really be decisive for the future of planet Earth.
Yeah. Well, thanks for the for this great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks, likewise.